Welcome back, everybody. We will now focus on sustainability and security. I'm the CEO of ISFC, or the International Sustainable Finance Center, an apolitical and independent, relatively new think tank headquartered in Prague. And this actually marks quite an important moment in time for us. For this entire week, we have been talking about sustainable finance and sustainability in business, in investing, in banking, in different parts of the financial and business ecosystem. And we thought that it would be very appropriate to start the week with Mr. Ian Bremmer and Professor Alexander Stubb, and to also finish the week with very distinguished and well-known speakers about sustainability and security. So we thought it would be an interesting session at the end of this very long and very insightful week to focus on biodiversity and on the changes that are happening across the globe in geopolitics and finance. And with us today, we have two fantastic experts in their own fields, very well known. And I will start with Shada Islam. Thank you so much for joining us. She is the Chief Editor-in-Chief of EU Observer. And Shada has been involved in foreign affairs and politics for a very, very long time, actually. I think last time I saw Shada speak was at Friends of Europe back in Brussels. And now she currently runs her own global advisory company focusing on strategy called New Horizons Project. She has done stints with the College of Europe. She has worked across Brussels, but also internationally in the US. And with us today also we have Dr. Simon Zadek, who is joining us from Switzerland, I believe. Again, I believe Mr. Zadek is one of the very interesting thinkers with a very unique experience based on his work for Finance for Biodiversity at the moment. He is the chair of this initiative. He's also co-chair of the Technical Committee on the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, that is starting to get a lot of attention. Before that, I remember that at one point, I met Simon when he was working for the UNEP's inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system together with Professor Nick Robbins. So I'm extremely excited to have two fantastic thought leaders with us today to actually unpack the question that we have posed. Are sustainability and security two sides of the same coin? Do we have to start looking at both of these in relation? Do we have to look at these differently? So let's start with the first question that we wanted to pose to Shada. You have been at the forefront of foreign affairs and security discussions in Brussels and across the globe for many years, and you have a good expertise on the topic. So in the last few years, have you seen change in the thinking about security in Europe? Have there been any significant developments? And has climate become a fixture, not only in our newspapers and publications, but has it been firmly placed on the global security agenda? Please, Shada.
Thank you so very much, Linda. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here, and so thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, this is a very crucial question, and you asked me about the evolving security thinking in Europe in the last few years, and whether climate policy is now very much part of the global security agenda. It's a fascinating question and a very crucial one. So the European Union has become more of a security actor in the last few years, and I've seen this evolution starting with the EU being quite sure of itself as a soft power and not really engaging in hard security issues. It was done with a mixture of some, I would say, some kind of modesty as well. And interestingly, parts of the world, the EU's focus on non-traditional security. So even then, on questions of environment, on climate, on biodiversity, deforestation, but also questions like human trafficking and hunger. These were questions of non-traditional security, which the EU quite successfully, I would say, brought on to the global agenda. In a sense, it was aligned, you may remember, with Japan, which talked very much about human security as well. And increasingly, this, let's say, hitherto soft power, soft security player, has been engaging in more and more hard initiatives. So security, maritime security, security, all of those questions have become very much part of the EU's conversations with its major partners, including, of course, the United States, but also in Asia and Africa. The EU is engaged in quite a few security missions, military missions in Africa, but also working on counterterrorism initiatives there. So very much a focus on inside the EU. You know, of course, Linda, we've been talking about strategic autonomy, and very much a question of the EU taking its security destiny in its own hands and sort of working to make sure that it has this autonomy. So a lot of important initiatives already there. And now, of course, we have a war in Europe. We have the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that has speeded up the conversations that we're having in the EU and between the EU and its partners on security issues. Now, you know, of course, in rapid succession over the last 3 months now, since the invasion on February 24th, we've seen many spectacular, I would say, initiatives and policy decisions by the EU. There has been, of course, a commitment and actually action to increase defense spending. So I've heard that an additional 200 billion euros have been set aside for defense expenditure. Now, that's a big change from the past because you may remember the EU was under pressure from the US and other countries to increase its defense spending. The EU is supplying Ukraine with heavy weaponry. Relations have become stronger. And just yesterday, there was a new package announced where the EU is going to work together to stop its fragmented and rather inefficient defense and security actions at the moment. So looking at how to replenish the stocks of military equipment, but also looking at investment gaps in the EU's defense, industrial and technological base. Now, on your other question of whether climate policy is now very much part of the security agenda, it is so, of course, on the global stage, but I would say that within the EU as well. And once again, the Ukraine war, the war underway in Ukraine has highlighted the need to make climate policy, the EU's Green Deal, the EU's green transition plans, into a very important part of its security agenda. And this has been said very clear. So the Green Deal is now not just green transition, a very major part of the EU's move towards renewables, but also part of its security agenda. And of course, the war in Ukraine has highlighted the fact that the EU generally is very dependent on Russian gas, fossils, and has speeded up action at the EU level, at least policy action, to wean this off this dependency and into an agenda which is more focused on renewables. But Linda, you know, this is not easy. It's years and decades of dependency. You cannot just move things very quickly into a new section, into a new era, and that is causing, and we can talk about it later on, quite a lot of discussion and debate within the EU, especially as during this period of transition, there will be a use of coal. So that is, of course, making some climate activists and green activists very worried. And of course, nuclear energy is now being brought back. So that's making a few people who are anti-nuclear very uneasy as well. So the conversations are ongoing. And as I said initially, this is very much part of the conversation, the discussions that are going to dominate the European Union in the coming months. Thank you.
I think it's a good starting overview, especially with the rise of energy. And of course, energy is massively linked to security and also sustainability. We here have convened in Prague, in Czech Republic, which actually has still coal and gas dependency. So this is a real mixture of problems that we need to resolve, and sustainability is definitely part of the solution. Well, let me move now to you, Simon. Climate change has been a huge concern. We had one of the largest COP26 conferences in Glasgow, where we also saw a huge turnout of the financial sector. In some ways, I don't think I had ever seen that many finance professionals at a COP before. So Biodiversity, however, also is absolutely critically important. However, the biodiversity conference that was hosted later did not attract quite the same numbers of attendees from finance. So since you're sitting there as a chair for the Finance for Biodiversity, it would be absolutely fantastic to hear more about the work that you're doing and also why biodiversity is systematically important for security.
Thanks very much indeed. Let me try and not jump completely away from the previous comments, but to build on them slightly. I think that we face crises and respond, and sadly have actually not embraced climate or food security as a security agenda until now. And the evidence for that is perfectly straightforward, as we have found ourselves facing an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Of course, we've had to deal with the fact that Europe has not reduced its dependency on oil and gas imports in the way in which it should, from Russia and from elsewhere. And the very fact that we're facing the energy price crisis that we are, and potentially a supply crisis, is a sign that we have failed to understand the relationship between energy security, climate security, and broader security issues. And I would say the same when it comes to food. Today we see 4 global corporations largely responsible for the production and trade of a very large majority of the world's wheat. How could we have allowed such concentration risk to emerge and to only think about it, in inverted commas, in the context of the kind of crisis that we face today? If we had really engaged in the sustainable food transition agenda in an appropriate way at an earlier point, we wouldn't today arguably be facing a situation where potentially several billion people are facing food hunger as a result of the Ukraine war. So although I generally love to congratulate Europe for all kinds of things that it does well, in this instance, I think we have grossly fallen short, both in the context of energy systems and the link to climate, and in the context of food systems and the way in which food production and commodity markets actually operate today. Now, making the link across firstly to finance and then to nature, we've seen the response to the energy crisis and the increase in gas and oil prices as being an announcement by many of the world's largest oil and gas companies of a massive surge in investment in exploration and extraction for use of fossil fuel for burning. So far from moving towards a clean energy response as a result of the crisis, in fact, we have one of the largest surges in investment in fossil fuel extraction that we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years. What is the response to that on the part of Europe, or indeed more broadly, the international community? Well, the response is that that is either a good thing, or it may not be a good thing, but these are private actors and they can do what they want with their money. And clearly that has nothing to do with sustainable finance and has nothing to do with climate security or green energy. And we see the same thing in the food space. In the short term, we need to obviously figure out how to deal with a crisis of untold proportion that could unravel at this stage. But actually the underlying point is that even although we had a high-level UN Food System Summit in September last year, overseen by the UN Secretary General, there was almost no discussion in that summit of concentration risk, particularly in prime commodities, particularly wheat and fertilizer, notably potash. And that topic was left completely off the stage. Now, finally, then, let me come to the issue of nature, where in many ways we see the same crisis without any particular response. It doesn't take a genius or a biologist to understand that our seas are dying and our forests are burning or being pulled down, and our rivers are polluted and are no longer serving their needs. And that will flow through to much deeper endemic problems with food security, which in turn will flow across into increased forced migration and the many, many problems and tragedies associated with that. So how are we thinking about nature today? Well, there are lots of things going on, and we should celebrate that. But actually, from an international crisis or security point of view, nature is not thought about in those terms. It's thought beyond the climate agenda, such as the role the Amazon has in sequestering carbon. It is thought of as a local problem, and therefore one that doesn't really merit security status by the international community. And yet, of course, high-focused areas of nature will lead to flow-overs into accelerated climate change and flow-overs into a continuous and increasing food security problem, not addressed at all by the international security community. So, yes, there are things going on. Yes, there are always things to celebrate. Yes, there are insights that come through crisis, including the crisis we have today in the context of Ukraine. But the reason we have that crisis in part and the flow over to energy and to food is because we haven't responded in the way in which we need to. We have allowed the financial community to continue, including now, to invest in accelerated amounts in fossil fuel extraction. And we don't really have a game plan or a security lens on the topic of nature at all.
Thank you, Simon. I think that's a very powerful, very good synopsis of where we stand with the situation. I think it's also very interesting to think about Ukraine in this context that you touched upon, and Shada also mentioned it. So now we have a much more revived, you could say, NATO alliance, and we might have new members joining. And the interesting thing is that NATO already for a while has been exploring climate or climate-related geopolitical changes and the risks hiding there. So it will be interesting to also see whether that now with the revived alliance, we can also maybe push them into thinking broader and seeing these systemic interlinkages and risks between commodity markets, food security, and how systemically we can really address these issues, because we tend to do quick fixes and reactionary actions, but not necessarily rethinking for bigger impact. Let me bring this back to Shada now. We are having this conversation. We have the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We don't know how it's going to end, when it's going to end. And this week's Economist magazine's main cover is all about food crisis. So I'm really glad that Simon mentioned it already. So from your point of view, what would be the most significant transformational things that come from the conflict in Ukraine? And from the systematic point of view, what kind of suggestions or recommendations you would have for the European authorities in Brussels and also for the sustainability community? Because often we all work in silos. There's the silo of biodiversity work and research often, then there's a silo on energy. So what would be your suggestion also to people who are working on these different topics in sustainability? Do we need to talk more to the security community? or do we just need to create some sort of new pathways and new collaborative initiatives that connect the dots on these different topics?
So Linda, is exactly I was going to make that we live in a world where knocking of joined up approaches, communities work in fragmented ways, and this silo mentality, which is not just among policymakers within things and the world of activism. And it's also the lack of long-term thinking. Simon has alluded to it, but it has been something that has disappointed pressed me in the years that I've been working first as a journalist and as a think tank advisor, is that we are now in the midst of war, and of course, to deal with crises and the emergencies that come, we have the capacity, the brainwidth, if you like, the broadband needed to think also about, as Simon said, and you have said, about the systemic changes that need to come. I don't see that happening. I see very much the tribulations of Ukraine. About food security, and I've been warning about the food situation for months now. Remember, the war has aggravated an already very, very difficult situation that COVID-19. And it's another thing. We have short attention spans. We're almost now thinking of COVID as having a way. Well, actually, it hasn't. It still is very much present, for instance, in China. And we haven't talked about how China's economy and the troubles it's facing is impacting the world as well in terms of our growth prospects. So there's very much a feeling here and in our think tank circles, academic circles of us and them. So we saw this very much during the pandemic, whether first of all, even in Europe, if you like, was very much looking ourselves and then line is safe until one is safe. And of course, we still think, vaccines for Africans or Asian countries. And so the recourse to protectionist national, a kind of Euro approach is something that I think we really need. It's the systemic weaknesses of the European Union as it goes forward into this new, which I think is going to be a era. When you talk about a NATO alliance, I'm sure that we're looking at the national so-called security, as I said, impact on our daily life. Now, looking at the crisis today, 50 million people are on the brink of famine, according to World Bank figures. As I said, it comes on the make devastating economies. This is a question also of political upheaval, social death. When you think on this happening, Sri Lanka is happening in Pakistan. It could happen tomorrow in other parts of maybe Indonesia. People rising up, unrest streets. But because, as you've said, rising energy prices mean food prices, even where our food supplies are dependent on Ukraine or Russia, but our fertilizer are sunflower oil as well. So when prices rise, a cost of living rises. We've already seen as being predominant at the moment, but also during the presidential elections, where Marine Le Pen, the far right leader, came up with a living question. We're going to see, I would say, we're going to see an auto here in Europe as well, back from our holidays, and we see our rising, our prices rising, and food prices rising as well. So if it continues, as many fear will, I'm afraid not ready to
Thank you, Shada. I'm glad you brought in the question about China and our critical dependencies and systemic vulnerabilities. We often talk about critical minerals and the kind of resources that we also need to create the green transition. And I think that's going to be something that will be very, very important going forward. So the work with China, the work with also other global actors, to bring those countries on board and try and forge better relationships to actually create the green transition. I have another question for Simon. I remember your work at UNEP for the designing of a sustainable financial system. You have been involved in this discussion about finance and sustainability for a very long time. And since this is a sustainable finance summit, I would absolutely love to hear from you in terms of what are your lessons that you learned through your work, through decades of work on these systemic issues. What are the most interesting lessons and takeaways you'd like to share with us today? And also, is there an opportunity to leverage finance for a more positive impact? And if yes, then why are we failing to do so? And how can we improve the situation?
Thanks very much indeed. And yes, you're absolutely right. As one gets older, it becomes easier to say that one's been working for decades on things. So you're right. It seems to have stretched into the past. So what have we learned? So the financial system is complex, dynamic, hard to nudge, very responsive and able to game all manner of attempts to shove it in particular directions, particularly at scale. And even public finance is hard, as we found, to really direct in relation to high-level policy objectives such as climate or nature and so on. We've learned that the mindset shift away from we need financial flows to do something to thinking about finance as a system that needs to be shaped like all systems, health systems and others, is the only real way to think about particularly how to leverage and reallocate private capital towards sustainability outcomes. The UNEP inquiry was not the first time anyone had talked about central banks. It was really in the context of the sort of green finance revolution, at least, the first time really one had begun to think about the role of central banks and financial regulators and others in shaping the way finance as a system dealt with issues like climate and now also other issues as well. All very good. And when China, arising out of that period of change, agreed to form the Green Finance Study Group in the finance track of the G20, a really unique moment, if you like, in international policy making at the nexus between environment and finance. We began to get some traction in that second point, which is really thinking about global policy goals like climate, nature security, and so on, and thinking about how one needs to shape finance as a system accordingly. That has translated into lots of specific things. So this is not an abstract or theoretical conversation. It has changed the way many central banks around the world are thinking about financial stability in relation to climate, now increasingly also in relation to biodiversity, the way IOSCO and many other odd-named standards institutions that no one outside of the financial sector has ever heard of is beginning to think about where that broader sustainability agenda fits into their role in setting the rules of the way in which international financial markets and capital markets actually work. So that's good, but slow. Yeah. So what do we learn one level down? Well, we learned that in the renewable space, for example, the real accelerators were partly to do with the falling cost of technology, but had significantly to do with financial innovation. The feed-in tariffs emerging out of Germany and the way in which that allowed renewables to move from a sort of high-risk technological ambiguity into a standardized package model that had guaranteed offtakes and therefore was attractive to capital markets, and that pushed down the cost of capital and accelerated the investment into that space. And now we need to look for a similar approach as it relates to the food system. And that's likely to be in, again, areas that are more commoditizable, such as alternative protein and vertical farming, both of which can be developed at scale and is understood by the investment community essentially as infrastructure investment with associated revenue streams. So we can learn from the way in which we've innovated in relation to renewable energy and translate that not simply, but with some interesting developments into the way in which we think about large-scale investment in food system transition. And then finally, I want to come back to the crisis, if you like, and make three very, very brief observations based on your question. First of all, the truth is we just shouldn't allow continued large-scale investment in carbon assets. And so observing it and ignoring it because it's deemed to be the private sector is simply not acceptable given the heat wave of mid-40s in India this week and the expected heat wave in Spain of mid-40s next week. And that's just May and the beginning of the year. So there comes a point where risk modeling and all sorts of delicate standards no longer do the job, and we have to resort to policy insistence. And I think that moment is coming in a number of areas. Secondly, we need to accelerate the deconcentration of risk of global food, the point that I made earlier and what's become so apparent in the context of the Ukraine war, and initiatives similar to feed-in tariffs to accelerate the localization of food chains, which is mixing policy, public finance, and private finance. It is ultimately the only way in which we are going to reduce the concentration risk that today is creating such an extraordinary problem. And as part of that, we need to open up one of the areas of finance and trade that has not been permeated by the sustainable finance community, which of course is the soft and hard commodities markets that are really underpinning how wheat and other products are being traded and priced as we speak today. And so I think we've learned a lot, but we don't always act on that learning, but we could. And there are several responses, I think, to the immediate crisis that doesn't solve the instant tragedy of the war and the prospects of food-related hunger and poverty, but does begin to establish the basis on which financial markets can be harnessed to try and overcome some of those endemic risks going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really like your 3 points. I think that the policy and regulatory alignment is absolutely crucial. We still have not aligned all the incentive systems, so that's why we also see a real difficulty in licensing for wind, licensing for a variety of different projects, and we don't have a sufficient sustainable climate related project pipeline across Europe. So we really struggle with that and we need to improve it. We are pretty much out of time. So I'll just ask one very quick question. Maybe you can condense it into a couple of sentences. What would be the one key message that you'd like to also send to the security community? Because as I mentioned before, I believe there's not very much interaction between these different communities. One of the last times I was in Brussels, I was called into a rather bizarre meeting of mainly military companies producing military equipment, and I started asking sustainability-related questions, and there was just a shock and deep silence after the questions. So it'd be very interesting if we can try and amplify and send this message also to the other parts of the system. So I'll start with Shada, but one quick request, Shada. I think we had some issues with audio earlier, so if you could try and switch off your video for the answer so that we don't have any disruption in the audio. Thank you. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. I have just switched off my video.
Yes, and we can hear you perfectly.
I think Linda, All right, good. So, Linda, I think the one thing is that we need to broaden our agenda when it comes to the security discussions. And I agree with you. I've taken part in many meetings as well when societal issues, climate issues, issues to do with migration are hardly ever talked about, whereas sometimes we over-securitize certain questions as well. So I think we need to be more lucid and clear-eyed when we're having these discussions in EU circles. We need to connect. And I think very importantly, going forward, we need to stop. I think to start with, faced with a famine, a hunger, prospect of hunger, and we have to start to work together. I think of democracies versus autocracies, absolutely. We need to work together, like-minded or non-like-minded countries, because greater problems solved by working together. Issues to do with nature, climate change, and security issues. We need together.
Thank you very much. And Simon, now to you. Would be very interesting to hear your thoughts.
Well, I don't know if it's very interesting, but I'll keep it short. I think that the way in which the financial system works needs to be a security issue, not just because of the risks of financial instability, but the risks of asset allocations that create insecurities across our lives. And I don't think that's the way the security community has ever thought about the financial system. And I think now, in the context of both asset allocation in the energy sector and asset allocation and the workings of markets in the food system, the time is ripe and now for the security community to look at the financial system through that lens.
Thank you. I think that's a fantastic way to finish, especially because of what we have seen in the aftermath of the invasion in Ukraine, seeing all the hidden assets and all the problems that we have in the financial system that we were aware of for a long time, but maybe we didn't have the pressure to tackle them. And we really see how the financial and economic systems can create major security issues and can prevent us actually to create better prosperity and security from very traditional sense, but also from new types of risks that we neglect to address in a timely fashion. With this, we will finish this session now. Thank you so much for joining. I know you had to clear your very, very busy schedules. May tends to be very busy prior to the holiday period. So thank you again for joining us. And thanks everybody who joined this very intense and very fascinating week where we explored everything. We looked at banking, we looked at innovation, at innovating finance and financing innovation. We looked at sustainable finance agenda across the world, and especially in the EU and the CEE countries. And we also looked at energy issues. So we covered a lot of ground, and thanks everybody for joining, for supporting us. Please feel free to stay in touch with us, and we will look forward to seeing you again next year for another 5 days of fun. Thank you very much.